Hello, Dr. J here for Chapter 5, video number 3. So we're going to talk about two really important concepts, the difference between a membrane being semi-permeable and being selectively permeable. So we're really talking here about the plasma membrane, although this is true for many membranes of different organelles, such as mitochondria and the Golgi. All of these membranes will be able to allow some things to come through, but not everything, and be able to control what comes through. So this image is just showing a phospholipid bilayer, which is your membrane. And it's trying to illustrate that some molecules will be able to pass right through the membrane, and some molecules will require proteins to move through the membrane. And membrane transport, I believe, is your next video. Yes. Okay. Sorry. So remember that the plasma membrane is what defines the cell barrier. It's how the cell interacts with the environment. So through these different transmembrane proteins that cross the plasma membrane. It's a flexible membrane, right? So cells, especially animal cells, can change shapes, and cells will control these different membranes, will control these different proteins in the membrane based on gene expression. And we talk about gene expression way much later in the semester. So what does semi-permeable mean? So something that is not permeable is like a desk. It's solid. Semi always means kind of. So a semi-permeable membrane means some things can pass through, other things cannot. And this is showing you things like gases and hydrophobic molecules and small polar molecules. Remember, you learned about polar molecules in the first video. They can pass right through that membrane. So the membrane has no control over these molecules passing through. They are able to pass through by the nature of they're very small in size, and they're primarily hydrophobic, and except water and ethanol are always, in biology you'll always learn whatever rule there is, there's always an exception. So that's water and ethanol. And we'll talk about this more in a little bit. But molecules that are large and nonpolar, large and polar, so have a partial charge, or fully charged molecules, they cannot pass through the membrane. And that's because the membrane, remember, is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. And that internal part, so there's little hydrophilic heads on the membrane, and then the bulk of the membrane, the inside, is hydrophobic. I hope I said that right. Hydrophilic on the outside, hydrophobic on the inside. So a molecule that is hydrophilic, like something that's polar or charged, is going to interact with the heads, but then as it tries to pass through, it's repelled by that hydrophobic. So hydrophobic likes hydrophobic, lipids like lipids. Hydrophilic likes hydrophilic. Water, polar, charged molecules like each other. So they can interact, and then the hydrophobic and hydrophilic repel each other. So because there's such a large hydrophobic region, polar molecules and charged molecules cannot pass through. They get, like that little diagram shows, kind of rebounded off. So what you need to remember is that for a semi-permeable membrane, some things can get through, and those things are gases, like oxygen and carbon dioxide, and these will become really important in the next unit when we talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. There are some small uncharged polar molecules like water and ethanol are the two most common ones. Ethanol, alcohol. Water, it's little enough that it can kind of snake through between those phospholipids and go across the membrane. Larger, this doesn't have it, larger hydrophobic molecules can also pass through. So let's just see back here. Hydrophobic. So lipids, like lipids, can pass through. So things without a charge, made up of primarily carbons and hydrogens, can pass through. When you get to things that are charged or polar and larger, they cannot. So larger uncharged or polar molecules, uncharged polar, sorry. And anything with a charge is not going to pass through. So even though ions are teeny, they're just elements, they cannot pass through because of that full charge. They get repelled by the hydrophobic interior of the membrane. Now, obviously the cell needs to move in some of these things like amino acids and sugars and nucleotides and ions. So how does it do that? Membranes can be selectively permeable. So this means that membranes have proteins in the membrane, and this is what the whole next lecture is about. These are transmembrane proteins, so they cross the membrane, and they're very specific. So in the next video we'll talk about channels and carriers and pumps. And even though a protein channel looks like this open little tunnel, it's very specific. It only lets certain types of ions or polar molecules through. And that's the same with carrier proteins, and then we'll talk about pumps, which is a form of active transport. So different membranes have different proteins in them, so therefore different membranes can transport or move across the membrane different types of molecules. So this is selective permeable, means that the cell, or sorry, let's do it this way. The membrane controls what passes across. Okay, so semi-permeable, no control, it's whatever can fit across that membrane or whatever is not repelled. Selectively permeable means I'm selecting you to move across, and that is based on the proteins in the membrane. Why is this important for us to understand as biologists or chemists? It's really important for drug design. So if you are trying to get a drug to cross a membrane to affect a cell, you needed to cross that membrane without relying on specific proteins. Because remember I said proteins are very specific, these carriers and channel proteins, and so they're not going to be specific for the drug that you design. So one of the ways, or one of the things that drug design chemists have to take into account is they have to make drugs that are small, because large drugs are just going to get repelled by that membrane. They have to make drugs that are not ionized, so they have to remove that charge, or else again the drug will not pass through. And they have to make the drug what we call lipophilic. So lipo means the lipids, means hydrophobic, and so it has to love that hydrophobic interaction, or that have that non-polar part to it, so that it can cross the membrane. So hydrophilic, water-loving drugs will get stuck outside of the cell. surrounded by water, they won't be transported through. So here's something I want you to think about, and it's a great little test of your knowledge. So I would suggest you pause the video for a second, and you look at these 6 different molecules, and think about which ones you think can cross the membrane without any help. Are you thinking? Did you pause the video? Okay, so I'm going to reveal the answers, but this is really important to test yourself, because you might see questions like this, on a quiz or exam. Hint, hint. Okay, so the first one that definitely cannot cross is calcium ions. It has a charge. Charges, even ions, even though they're small, nope, they don't go across. Water can. Water is that weird exception that even though it has that slight negative and slight positive charge, it's small enough to cross through. And this is probably essential for life. Okay. Oh, look here. You've got charges. You've got negatives. This one, nope. That's a nucleotide. That cannot pass through. And this other one, remember we talked about, oops, my pen doesn't want to work. Polar molecules having OH groups. Look at all these OH groups. This is very polar, and therefore that molecule, which is, I believe, fructose, cannot pass through. It's a carbohydrate. I just don't always remember which one it is. So that leaves these other two. Okay, well, so this other one you see, oh, it has an OH. Well, you know what? That's only a teeny little bit of the protein of the molecule. Sorry, this molecule is primarily carbons and hydrogens. So this is actually testosterone. So I want you to see that a large nonpolar molecule, a hydrophobic molecule, a lipid, can actually pass through the membrane. So that's how our hormones can make us all crazy at times. They can pass right through that membrane. This one over here is a fatty acid. Well, I took off the acid part not to confuse you. So see all these carbons and hydrogens? You remember from the water lecture that carbon hydrogens are nice nonpolar bonds, and so this molecule is nonpolar. And yes, this one can cross. So you have 3 molecules that can cross and 3 molecules that cannot cross. So if this is not making sense to you, go back to the water video 1 for chapter 5 and relook at what makes something polar and what makes something nonpolar, and that will help you determine which molecules can cross the membrane, just in case you see that on an exam or something. All right, that's all for now. Bye.